Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is week 8, and today I'd like to talk with you about work and the working class in the Victorian period. The last few weeks we talked about the ideals, the Victorian values, about family life and education, and more often than not, perhaps with some aspects of education aside, this all mostly addressed the issues of the middle class, which, as you already know, was the dominant social class in Victorian Britain. However, the working people were much more numerous. They would constitute at least 3/4 of the society at any given moment. So let us look now at the working life and the life of the poor section of Victorian England. And today I'll be mostly using the chapter about working life from Sally Mitchell's book for inspiration, but also lots and lots, and I really mean lots, of documentaries and online materials that I strongly encourage you to watch for yourselves, especially if you are planning to write your final essay on anything connected with work in Victorian society. So the first thing I'd like to talk with you about is perhaps the form of work in which the working class interacted most with the upper classes. That is domestic service. Domestic servants were, as you know now, a very important part of Victorian life. The ability to employ servants, be it one servant or more, was a very important status symbol for the middle class and something that was taken absolutely for granted for the upper classes. So I guess Sally Mitchell says at one point that domestic service was the third largest employer for women in the 19th century. And generally, if we look at the number of households who needed domestic servants, it grew a lot during Victoria's reign. Most of these servants would live with the family, so of course it all depended on the size of the household and the lodging available for servants, but they would be live-in servants who would be expected to serve the family all the time. I already mentioned that one servant was not enough to free the lady of the house completely from doing some of the chores herself. For let's say an average middle class household, you needed at least 3 servants, but if your household was larger, if you had more children, if you had higher social status, the necessity to employ more and more servants increased. And of course it could go as far as to the situation described, for example, in Downton Abbey. It mostly talks with a later period, so the legacy of the Victorian system and the Edwardian system, which is kind of the continuation of the Victorian system. So the life in an aristocratic manor house, which employed lots of servants, but some of the aspects of the life of the servants really remained the same since the Victorian period. And here comes the first documentary mini-series I would like to recommend to you. The title is Servants, The True Story of Life Below Stairs. 3 episodes. If you want to see for yourself, if you want to see some examples of households and the testimonies, the accounts of the life of the servants, absolutely go and watch it. But for now, let's now talk a little bit about the hierarchy of the servants, because of course we are talking about large households like the ones belonging to aristocracy and the richest members of the upper middle class. So those who had large manor houses and grounds and gardens, and sometimes in case of the aristocracy this could mean two houses. One, the family manor house, and the other one in London, which would be used during the parliamentary season. So they would employ many people. They would employ several dozen of servants, but then of course not all the servants would interact with the family, but there would be naturally some sort of internal hierarchy of the servants. And this is a little graph I made, and this would be something I would probably write on the blackboard if we were in class now. So this is more or less the hierarchy of the servants in a large household. So as you can see straight away, there are three tiers. There is a separate set of servants for the kitchen, then for the house, then for the nursery. Kitchen is more or less simple, so these would be the people who are employed to prepare food, to prepare preserved foods to keep longer, to feed the family, to feed other servants as well, and to clean up after all the cooking and eating. The household staff would be mostly connected with cleaning, doing the laundry, serving the family, sometimes helping with daily things like, I don't know, shaving or doing hair or dressing up for the ladies, lacing all those corsets and stuff. Sometimes serving at the table, especially when the guests were present. This is the household stuff. And if you know anything about Victorian life, especially in the city, it required a lot of cleaning, and cleanliness was a very important status symbol. So lots of people were employed to do the dusting and the polishing and to maintain all the lamps and all the fireplaces that were used in the household. The nursery staff is of course the staff connected with the care for children. The average number of children, as you know, in the Victorian family was higher than today, between 5 and 6 on average, with many families having more children, so they required people to look after the children. So let us now quickly look at those positions and which positions were, let's say, more senior and which were more junior. There were all kinds of perks connected with the senior positions. For example, the senior staff members ate separately from the junior staff members in large households. They might even be served by the junior staff members. They would be eligible for any perks of the trade, like leftover food or discarded clothes or other domestic objects. I don't know, candle ends and rags and anything that the family wanted to discard. They would not throw it away. They would give it to the servants to use as they please. They could use it for themselves, or they could sell it for additional profit. So that's the situation. So relatively the easiest situation is with the nursery. There would be the main responsible person, usually a mature woman, called a nurse by the family and nanny by the children themselves. Then one or more of the nursery maids so more junior servants, to help her to care for the children. This of course would mean this kind of physical care, keeping the children clean and fed, and perhaps teaching them some basic skills, because for any education there would be separate staff consisting of a governess or a tutor. The situation of the governess or a tutor would be actually above the servant. So she would not eat with the servants, she would neither eat with the family. This was a particularly lonely position in a Victorian house. But there we go. Wet nurses, that is special servants who are employed to care for babies and breastfeed them with their own milk, were still known. They were not as popular as, say, before Victoria's accession or in the 18th century, but they were still sometimes employed to look after babies. Not all rich women breastfed their own babies, even though the social appreciation of motherhood was very, very high. Now let's look at the kitchen staff. So the head of the kitchen was the cook. In the absolutely largest aristocratic households, you might have two cooks, a male chef and a female cook, and the male chef would cook for the family and guests, and the female cook, the plain cook so-called, would cook for the other servants. If there were so many servants that it was a good decision to employ somebody to cook just for them, because of course if they were living with the family they had to be clothed and fed, then there would be two cooks. But in most families there is one cook, usually again a mature woman with some experience. She would oversee the general production of food and making the dishes. She would have several helpers depending on the size of the household. They would be called kitchen maids. Sometimes they might be further specialized, like a stillroom maid whose only job was to make jams and preserved meats and other to dried foods, so basically to preserve the foods, especially before refrigeration popularized, and throughout the 19th century they didn't have electric refrigerators, so this was always a good idea to make preserves. The lowest ranking person in the kitchen staff was the scullery maid. A scullery was a room adjacent to the kitchen where the running water was. So it was the place for cleaning of the vegetables, cleaning of the dishes, cleaning of the pots and pans. This was very hard work, unpleasant and long, and the scullery maid was the most junior member of the kitchen staff. It was absolutely possible to advance, so you could start your career in servants as a scullery maid, then advance to a kitchen maid, and eventually end your career as a cook. Usually not in the same household, but you would be given good references and you could change employment and go to another household to serve at a more prestigious place and better paid place than before. Now let's look at the household staff. This is also a bit more complex because you have the internal division between men and women servants. Having a male servant was again prestigious things in Victorian society. Early in the 19th century, before Victoria's accession, there was a special tax on male servants. This tax was lifted during the 19th century, but still you would have to pay more for the men servants, and their uniforms, called a livery, were more expensive and more elaborate. Female servants basically also had uniforms, but these were simple dresses with aprons. For the men servants, The special kind of uniform was required, and it had to be provided by the employers. Only very few servants were exempted from this, and this was the housekeeper, the lady's maid, the butler, and the valet. They could wear their own clothes, which were, let's say, smart, elegant, not very fancy clothes of a gentleman or lady of modest means, let's put it this way. So it was absolutely out of the question if you wanted to employ male servants that they would be managed by a woman. So if you wanted to have male servants, perhaps even one footman, so a kind of general servant, to do harder work around the house, you would definitely need a butler. A butler would only have managerial duties. He would be the highest position in the house, and he would manage the more prestigious things like the budget. He would be trusted with the money, basically. He would be very often quite respected by the family and the servants. The master of the house would call him by his last name, so the mark of equality, and all the other servants would have to call him Mr. So if his name was, let's say, John Brown, he would be called Brown by the master of the house and Mr. Brown by all the other servants. Never by the first name, really. He would call the other servants by the first name, which was a mark of, let's say, a lower position. So here we have the butler, the overseer, responsible for any valuables in the house, for silver cutlery, for wine and spirits, and a kind of general manager of the house, and especially responsible for any male servants. Then the valet was a personal servant of the master of the house, who was responsible for helping him shave, for example, or take off his boots, or when the master traveled, the valet would accompany him during the travels. This was also a high position. He would be among the higher ranking servants. Then all other male servants, sometimes several in the house, would be generally called footmen. They might be upper footmen, lower footmen. It all depends on the size of the household and number of men employed. They would be basically doing all kinds of things around the house, like maintaining the fireplaces and cleaning the lamps, and doing some sort of small repairs around the house. A junior footman, so a kind of teenage boy learning to be a servant, was normally referred to as a page boy. They would carry the packets for the family and guests. They would clean the boots of the family. Sometimes a page boy would serve the butler. The butler might have his own page boy, so a most junior male servant in the house, just learning the trade. As far as women servants go, the most important female servant in the household staff was the housekeeper. She was a general manager. If there was no male servant and no butler, she would be the most important person in the household. She would oversee all the purchases for the house, so whatever was needed, like, I don't know, some tablecloths or candles or anything really of the kind of perishable things for the house, she would do it. She would also be responsible for hiring and firing all the female servants. This was a high-ranking position. And another high-ranking position was a lady's maid, so again a personal servant of the lady of the house, a very important position regarding Victorian fashions. So this was someone who would help the lady dress and undress, who would do her hair, who would mind some of her personal belongings and do perhaps some mending to her clothes. destaining of her clothes. She could sometimes do part of the correspondence of the lady, especially not private correspondence, but let's say some business matters or such stuff. She would mind the lady's pets if she had them. She would accompany the lady during shopping expeditions, for example, and sometimes even during visiting. She would wait in the carriage while the lady visited. Then there were a number of housemaids. Again, the number depended on the size of the household, with the possibility of lower and upper servants. There might be some specialized house servants, like a laundry maid, whose job was to oversee the washing of the clothes and bed and table linen or any other fabrics that needed washing for the family, and sometimes, of course, for the servants themselves. There might be more, so there might be an upper laundry maid, lower laundry maid, so it all depends on the size of the household. In smaller households that could not afford having so many specialized servants, the usual way was to employ a maid of all work. So somebody who would basically alternate between the household duties and the kitchen duties whenever she was more needed. So she would do the cleaning and some helping with the kitchen as well. So big households with this strict hierarchy normally would not have the maid of all work. They would be more specialized, but poorer households with just a few servants, very often they all relied on maids of all work. Then in the largest households there would be the outdoor stuff. And if you had outdoor stuff like gardeners or coachmen or grooms or stable boys, so people to look after the garden, to look after the carriage and the horses if you had them, you would need another senior servant called the house steward. He was responsible for all the employees that were working outside of the main house. So all the gardeners and stable boys and people looking after the carriages. So that's the situation. The conditions of the life of a domestic servant, of course, depended very much on the goodwill of the employer. If the master and the lady of the house were nice, humane people, they might not work their servants too hard. Also the butler and the housekeeper, if they were not too strict or too demanding. But generally this was hard work with very long working hours, with very few, if any, moments of respite. So in most households in the cities, the domestic servants would have half a day on Sunday or something like that. Sometimes one day off for Christmas, usually the second day of Christmas, the Boxing Day, was a day off for servants so they could visit their own families. But otherwise this was very long hours, hard physical work. For example, carrying all the washing water from the level of the kitchen, the scullery, which was usually in the basement in the cities, to the upper floors where the bedrooms were. So before the popularization of fitted bathrooms, the water had to be carried upstairs for the family to wash themselves, and then downstairs all by the servants. Plus all the cleaning, all the cooking, everything had to be done from scratch. Convenience foods are really the invention of the very last years of the 19th century. So it was really hard work, but work that many, especially young people from the working class, took as a kind of springboard to better opportunities in life. Especially young people from the countryside might go to the city and look for employment in domestic service with the view of catching something better, in case of women, perhaps getting married to a tradesman, to a shopkeeper, to a policeman, and then resigning and moving into the life of the middle class. This was of course supposed, especially for women, to be good practice for being housewives themselves, if they could find a husband with whom they would not have to work. So that's very quickly about the domestic servants. You can find more on that in the chapter, and now let's look at some other aspects of working life in Victorian England.